Hello again. This week we are looking at chapter 2 of Ruth. Last week in chapter 1 we saw how Naomi and her Moabite daughters-in-law were widowed in Moab, and how Naomi and Ruth, who swore undying devotion to her mother-in-law, moved back to Bethlehem. This was a season of intense loss and grief for both women, especially Naomi, who had lost her husband and both of her sons. Upon arriving in Bethlehem, she called herself Mara, bitterness, because she was once full but was now empty. This week we will see how God begins to turn the situation around. Chapter 2 has 3 distinct scenes. The first is a short conversation with Ruth and Naomi. The second sees Ruth gleaning in the field and her first meeting with Boaz. And the third is another conversation between Ruth and Naomi. But first, in verse 1, we have an editorial comment by the author introducing the reader to Boaz, a wealthy relative of Naomi's dead husband Elimelech. As we will see later, the fact that Boaz is of the same clan as Elimelech is of vital significance. After Boaz is introduced, we have the first conversation between Ruth and Naomi in verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I might find favour." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." At this stage, Ruth is still defined by her ethnicity. She is Ruth the Moabitess. Her ethnicity is an important aspect and is linked to one of the major themes of the book, that God accepts all people who acknowledge him and that he can use anyone in his redemptive plans. This verse further demonstrates Ruth's strength of character. She is submissive to her mother-in-law and seeks permission to glean in the field in order to provide for them both. Gleaning was back-breaking work in the hot sun undertaken by the poor. As a means of survival, Deuteronomy 24:19 made provision for the alien, the orphan, and the widow to be able to gather what was left over after the harvesters. As a poor alien widow, Ruth certainly qualifies for the task. Verses 3 to 17 form the second part of the chapter and deal with Ruth's experiences in the barley field. We're now reading verses 3 to 7. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "May the Lord be with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" The servant in charge of the reapers replied, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." Thus she came and has remained from morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. In this section, we see familiar folk storytelling techniques. We read that Ruth happens to come to the part of the field owned by Boaz, and that Boaz appears at the very place where Ruth is working. However, we will see that these coincidences are actually a part of God's providence. The type of field where this takes place was a common field where each owner farmed their own section. When Boaz arrived at his portion of the field, he notices a young woman that he doesn't recognise. Bethlehem was a small place, and so he asks, to whom does she belong? But before any of you have your feminist hackles raised, this could actually mean a variety of things, such as whose family is she from, who is her husband, or whose servant is she. Again, her foreign status is reiterated when the servant tells Boaz that she is the young Moabite woman who came back from Moab with Naomi. But in Boaz's response, we begin to see a change in Ruth's identity. Reading from verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favour in your sight, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." Then she said, "I have found favour in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, although I am not like one of your maidservants." At mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here, that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left. Here Ruth goes from being addressed as a foreigner to "my daughter." This signals a change in her status. It also indicates an age difference between Boaz and Ruth. We don't know how old Ruth is, only that Boaz refers to her as young woman in verse 5, and in chapter 3 he commends her for not going after young men. Naomi and her sons lived in Moab for 10 years, but we don't know when in that period that the sons married. Ruth doesn't have any children, so she could be quite young. In calling her "my daughter," Boaz demonstrates that Ruth is no longer just an alien, but that she is accepted as a part of Elimelech's clan. Boaz then tells Ruth to keep her eye on the women who work in his field and don't stray away from them. This is for her protection and provision. Boaz has told the men in his field to leave her alone and provided water for her to drink. We don't know exactly what Ruth is being protected from, but it's possibly linked to some form of mistreatment associated with her ethnicity. Ruth's response to this kindness is to bow down to the ground and ask why she is being shown favour because she is a foreigner. It's clear that in a country where Moabites were not fully accepted, that she sees herself as a lowly figure. But in verse 11, Boaz tells her that he's been told about how she left her own family and country because of her faithfulness to Naomi. It's clear that Boaz is not concerned with Ruth's ethnicity, but with her strength of character. He recognises that she's placed herself in God's care and asks that God will bless her for her actions. Again, we see the theme of God's broad redemptive plan. God is not only interested in the Israelites, but in all people who acknowledge him. In response to Boaz's kindness, Ruth now refers to herself as his maidservant. In asking that she might find favour in Boaz's eyes, it's as if she is taking those first tentative steps towards acceptance. Have you ever felt that you're not good enough? Isn't it horrible to feel that you don't fit in? It makes such a difference if somebody is kind to us when we feel like that. Kindness is also a theme of the book. Isn't it interesting that a woman who had just thrown herself on the floor, calling herself a foreigner, is able to see herself differently because somebody has been kind to her? How can we extend kindness to other people wanting to fit in? This can be people who want to fit into our society, our work environment, our church, or a group of friends. It's also interesting to note that Ruth experiences kindness from Boaz as a direct result of the kindness that she has shown to Naomi. Boaz's kindness is also evident in his provision for Ruth when he instructs the reapers to let grain fall purposely for her. Normally, gleaners had to wait at the edge of a field until they were given permission to gather the leftovers, but Boaz instructs his workers to let Ruth glean amongst the standing sheaves. At the end of the day, Ruth takes home an ephah of barley, which would be about 13 kilograms of barley. The last scene in the book involves Ruth and Naomi. When Ruth returns with an abundance of barley, Naomi asks who it was that took notice of her. When Ruth tells Naomi it was Boaz, Naomi can hardly contain her excitement. Reading verses 19 and 20. Her mother-in-law then said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead." Again, Naomi said to her, "The man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives." We see here the beginnings of the transformation of the women's lives. Naomi blesses Boaz and acknowledges that he is from the Lord and that God has not withdrawn his kindness from her after all. This time it is God showing kindness to both the women through Boaz. Naomi recognises the significance of Boaz's familial connection when she says that the Lord has not forsaken his kindness to the living or the dead. She knows that Boaz is a Goel, or kinsman redeemer. This was a close family member who had the responsibility of performing duties on behalf of a relative. This included buying back mortgaged property so that it would not be lost to the family, or buying back a relative who had been sold into slavery. In the next 2 chapters, we will see that Boaz's redemption extends beyond the traditional limits of kinsman redeemer. Aside from kindness, the other main theme in this week's reading is God's acceptance of people of all cultures. At the start of the chapter, Ruth is continually referred to as a Moabitess. She saw herself as a foreigner and couldn't understand why Boaz would be so kind to her, considering her status within the community. But just as God looks at the heart, Boaz saw beyond Ruth's ethnicity and recognised her as a person of worth who had left her own people to follow and help her mother-in-law. He also recognised that she had made a choice to see refuge in the God of Israel. In Galatians 3:28, we see God's attitude to people of different nationalities who come under his covering, when Paul states that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek. The writer of this book seems at pains to emphasise Ruth's ethnicity and show her integration into the people of God. In week 4, we will see that her inclusion extends to the royal line. In our groups this week, we'll be looking at inclusion and the ways we can extend kindness to those around us. I hope you have a blessed meeting and look forward to next week when we will see God's plan for restoration outworked in the lives of Ruth and Naomi.